Welcome to the Sleep Storyteller. I never thought silence could feel so heavy. When I first moved into this house, the quiet was what drew me in. Nestled on the edge of a sleepy town, the street was lined with trimmed hedges, sleepy lampposts, and porches that looked more like postcards than real homes. At night, everything seemed to hold its breath. No traffic, no sirens, no restless city sounds, just the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind decided to wander by. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. A fresh start, a calm place where I could finally breathe. The house itself wasn't anything grand, but it had character. 2 stories, creaking stairs, and a wraparound porch with chipped white paint that reminded me of childhood summers. The floors groaned under my steps like old bones, but I found comfort in that. It meant the house was alive, that it had its own language. In the day, the sun streamed through tall windows, filling every room with golden light. At night, the moonlight spilled across the floorboards, pale and silver, like a second skin stretched over the world. I unpacked slowly, turning the empty rooms into something resembling home. A bookshelf here, a worn armchair there. In the kitchen, I stacked plates I'd rarely use, and in the living room, I set up a lamp that gave off a warm yellow glow, soft enough to make the darkness feel less lonely. The bedroom upstairs was the most important. A heavy bed, a nightstand, and thick curtains I could draw closed when I wanted to pretend the outside world didn't exist. It was safe, I told myself. It was mine. The first few nights were blissful. I slept deeply, without the interruptions of sirens or neighbors stomping overhead like in my old apartment. Here, the only sounds that broke the silence were natural, an owl hooting, the distant bark of a dog, or the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night and just listen, amazed at how complete the stillness could be. It was as if time itself had stopped to let me rest. But with silence comes awareness. The longer I lived here, the more attuned I became to every creak, every groan, every whisper of the house settling into its bones. I told myself it was normal, that every house had its quirks. Still, there were moments when I felt something more behind those sounds, as if I wasn't the only one awake in the dark. It was on the 5th night, I think, when I first noticed it. I had fallen asleep with a book still open on my chest, the lamp beside me casting a dim glow over the pages. Sometime after midnight, I stirred, not from a dream but from something else. I didn't know what at first. My eyes fluttered open, and I sat up slowly, the quiet pressing against me like a blanket. And then I heard it, a faint thump, rhythmic and deliberate. 3 knocks. I froze. The sound came from downstairs, from the direction of the front door. It wasn't the house settling, no, this was different. Too precise, too intentional. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen. Seconds stretched into long, suffocating minutes, but nothing followed. Just silence again, heavy and suffocating. I told myself I must have imagined it, a dream bleeding into reality. I tried to laugh it off, though my chest felt tight. Who would be knocking at this hour? I slipped out of bed, my bare feet meeting the cold wood floor. Every step down the hallway seemed louder than usual, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. By the time I reached the top of the staircase, I had half convinced myself I was being ridiculous. There wouldn't be anyone at the door. I had locked it myself before bed, double-checking as I always did. Still, I crept down the stairs, the shadows stretching long and thin around me. When I reached the bottom, I hesitated. The front door loomed ahead, its glass panels reflecting the faint light from the street lamp outside. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the curtain that covered the window. With a quick motion, I pulled it aside. No one was there. The porch was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. The street lay still, every house dark, every tree unmoving. My breath fogged the glass as I pressed closer, searching for any sign of life. Nothing. Just the quiet street and the still night. I waited, heart thudding, before finally backing away. I checked the lock again, still secure, and made my way back upstairs, trying to calm my nerves. It must have been a dream, I told myself again. Or maybe the wind had knocked something against the door. Rational explanations were comforting, even if they didn't quite fit. By the time I crawled back into bed, exhaustion had begun to wash over me, and soon sleep dragged me under once more. The next morning, in the clear light of day, the memory seemed almost laughable. What was I so afraid of? Houses made noises. Old wood shifted, pipes groaned, branches scratched against windows. There was nothing unusual about it. I pushed the thought aside, went about my routine, and by evening, the fear had dulled to nothing more than a lingering shadow. But even as I prepared for bed that night, brushing my teeth and drawing the curtains closed, I couldn't shake the memory of those knocks. They had sounded real, too real. And somewhere deep down, a part of me was listening, waiting, wondering if I would hear them again. The following night began like any other. I had made a simple dinner, eggs and toast, nothing special, and curled up on the couch with a book. The silence was comforting again, though I caught myself glancing at the clock more than usual. Each tick of the second hand seemed louder than it should have been, as if the house itself was reminding me of something I didn't want to think about. When the hands finally crept past midnight, I found myself growing restless. I told myself not to be silly, that nothing had happened, nothing would happen, but still I turned on the lamp in the hallway before heading upstairs to bed. I slid beneath the blankets, the room cool and still. The faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs drifted up through the floorboards, but otherwise the night was silent. I tried to read a little more, but the words swam on the page. My eyes kept flicking to the clock on the nightstand. 12:01, 12:03, 12:05, each minute stretched out painfully long, the silence amplifying every creak of the house. By 12:06 my stomach was in knots. I stared at the ceiling, wide awake, telling myself I was ridiculous. And then it came. Knock. 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 3 deliberate raps against the front door. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. It was real this time, clear, unmistakable, too sharp to be dismissed as imagination. For a long moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The sound seemed to echo in the silence, pressing against my ears, against my chest. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed. My hands shook as I groped for the flashlight I had left on the nightstand. I didn't even remember why I had put it there, habit, maybe, or some quiet instinct that I would need it. My bare feet touched the floor, and I forced myself to stand, even as every muscle screamed for me to stay put. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the beam of the flashlight trembling with my grip. The closer I got to the front door, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as if the house itself was holding its breath with me. I paused at the bottom step, staring at the door. The brass handle gleamed faintly in the flashlight's glow, motionless, waiting. I swallowed hard and stepped closer. My free hand reached out, hesitating just inches from the curtain that covered the narrow window beside the door. Part of me screamed not to look, not to confirm what I already dreaded. But curiosity is a cruel master, and fear only sharpened it. With a quick, jerking motion, I yanked the curtain aside and pressed my face to the glass. Nothing. The porch was empty again, bathed in cold moonlight. No figure waiting in the shadows, no prankster ready to laugh at my fear. Just the silent street and the unmoving trees. For a long moment I stood there, hardly daring to breathe, waiting for movement. When nothing came, I let the curtain fall and backed away, my chest heaving. But the unease didn't fade this time. If anything, it grew stronger. I had heard it. The knocks were real. The sound still lingered in my ears, heavy and deliberate. My mind raced for explanations, maybe kids playing a prank? But who would be out at this hour, 2 nights in a row, in a neighborhood like this? And why disappear before I reached the door? No footsteps, no laughter, no sign of retreat. Just silence. I checked the lock again, still secure, still solid beneath my hand, and finally forced myself back upstairs. But the comfort of my bed felt foreign now. The blankets no longer warmed me, the silence no longer soothed. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every nerve on edge, waiting for another sound that never came. By morning, exhaustion had settled deep into my bones. I moved through the day like a ghost, distracted and uneasy. I found myself glancing at the door more than once, half expecting to see someone standing there, waiting. Each time the porch lay empty, but the image of it filled my mind regardless, someone unseen, watching, knocking, waiting for me to answer. That evening, I tried to shake it off. I made dinner, turned on the television, filled the house with noise in an attempt to drive away the silence. But the distraction didn't work. No matter how loud I made the world, I could still hear it, the memory of those knocks, the echo of their rhythm beating like a second heartbeat in my skull. When midnight approached again, I hesitated at the bedroom door. Part of me wanted to stay downstairs, to face whatever might come instead of cowering in bed. But another part whispered that I would be safer above, that maybe it wouldn't come if I hid away. In the end, fear won. I climbed the stairs and shut the door behind me, locking it though I knew it would do little good. I lay there in the dark, every muscle tight, every breath shallow. The clock ticked slowly toward midnight, each second dragging me closer to the moment I dreaded. I tried to tell myself it wouldn't happen, that last night had been a fluke. But as the numbers glowed 12:06, I already knew. And at 12:07, right on time, the knocking came again. Knock. 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 This time, though, it was louder. And I could have sworn, that faintly beneath the sound, I heard something else. A whisper. My name. I didn't sleep much after that second night. Even when the dawn crept in and the birds began to sing, the sound of the knocking haunted me, replaying over and over in my mind. It wasn't just the rhythm of it this time. It was the whisper. My name, drawn out, breathy, as if someone had pressed their lips right against the wood of the door and let the sound seep through. I told myself it wasn't real. I told myself that fear had played tricks on my ears, that exhaustion was to blame. But deep down, I knew. I knew what I had heard. The entire day, I felt as though I was walking through a fog. My chest was tight, my hands restless. Every noise made me jump, the groan of the refrigerator, the creak of the stairwell, the distant slam of a neighbor's car door. By afternoon, I was pacing the living room, unable to sit still. I found myself staring at the door again and again, tracing its edges with my eyes, searching for something I couldn't name. I thought about calling someone. A friend, maybe, or even the police. But what would I say? Excuse me, officer, someone knocked on my door at midnight and then whispered my name, but when I looked outside no one was there? They'd think I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. The longer I lived in this silence, the more it felt like the house was amplifying my fears, feeding them back to me until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. That evening, I tried to distract myself. I cooked a proper meal for the first time in days, chicken, rice, steamed vegetables. I left the television on in the background, though I didn't pay attention to the voices. I even poured myself a glass of wine, sipping it slowly in hopes that it would dull the tension thrumming through my veins. For a little while, it worked. The warmth spread through me, loosening my shoulders, lulling me into a fragile calm. But when the clock crept closer to midnight, the unease returned with a vengeance. I sat in the living room with the lights still on, the television volume turned low. My eyes flicked to the digital numbers on the clock. 11:59, 12 o'clock. My chest tightened, my fingers digging into the fabric of the couch. I tried to convince myself I wouldn't hear it this time, that whatever had happened before was finished. 12:07. Knock. 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 The sound rang out again, clear and sharp, rattling in my bones. My heart leapt into my throat. I sat frozen, the remote slipping from my hand and clattering onto the floor. I stared at the door across the room, willing it not to move, not to open. Then, just as before, came the whisper. This time there was no mistaking it. My name, spoken low and drawn out, curling through the air like smoke. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It slid into me, icy and intimate, as though the voice had been breathed directly into my ear. I shuddered, my skin crawling. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout for it to stop, to leave me alone. But my voice stuck in my throat. All I could do was sit there, staring, listening as the whisper repeated. Once. Twice. Then silence. The quiet was almost worse. I waited, muscles locked, but nothing else came. The knocking had ended, the voice had gone, and yet the weight of it lingered in the room, pressing down on me. Slowly, I forced myself to move, to stand, though my legs trembled beneath me. I edged toward the door, each step heavy, my flashlight clenched tight. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My fingers hovered near the curtain. Every instinct screamed not to look, not to pull it back. But I couldn't stop myself. With a sudden jerk, I yanked it aside and peered out into the night. The porch lay empty again. The street stretched silent, the lamppost casting pale light across the pavement. No figure, no shadow, nothing that could have produced that sound or that voice. My breath fogged against the glass as I leaned closer, scanning the darkness. Still nothing. I dropped the curtain back into place and stumbled backward, my chest heaving. My mind screamed for answers, but none came. How could someone whisper my name if there was no one there? How could knocks ring out so clearly when no one stood on the porch? I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay in bed with the lamp on, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing came. The house remained still. The silence returned. And yet, I knew it wasn't over. The next morning, I searched for explanations. I checked the porch, the yard, even the bushes near the door, looking for signs of someone hiding. There was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed grass, no scuff marks on the wood. It was as if the night had swallowed up all evidence. I sat on the porch steps, the sunlight warm on my skin, and felt a deep, gnawing dread settle in my stomach. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on anything, not reading, not cleaning, not cooking. All I could think about was the door, and the voice that had slipped through it like smoke. I started to dread the night before the sun had even begun to set. And when it finally did, I knew I was powerless. Midnight would come, and with it, the knocks. I could feel it deep in my bones, the inevitability of it. The house seemed to know it too, the air growing heavy, the shadows stretching long. As the clock neared midnight again, I sat in the living room, every light in the house blazing. I told myself I wouldn't look this time, wouldn't move, wouldn't answer. No matter what I heard, I would stay put. But when the hand struck 12:07 and the knocks rang out, louder, sharper, shaking the very wood of the door, I felt my resolve shatter. And when the whisper followed, curling through the silence, clearer than ever, my name, spoken like a promise, I knew this was only the beginning. After the third night, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The knocks weren't random, and the whispers weren't dreams. They were real. Every instinct I had screamed that something was happening, something beyond explanation. I spent the morning pacing the living room, staring at the front door as though willing it to remain closed and silent. But the memory of my name being spoken in that low, breathy whisper lingered like a stain I couldn't wash away. I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, someone playing a cruel joke on a newcomer. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. Who would know my name? Who would be brave, or insane, enough to appear night after night and then vanish without a trace? My rational mind could offer no answers, only questions that made my chest tighten. By afternoon, I found myself at the local library. I needed to know if anyone else had experienced anything similar, if the town had a history of strange happenings, or if there were old stories about the house itself. The building was quiet, the smell of dust and old paper comforting in its own strange way. I spent hours sifting through old newspapers, town records, and even the occasional diary left in the archives. And that's when I found it, a small clipping about something called the Midnight Visitor. According to the account, decades ago, there had been a series of unexplained disappearances in the area. People would hear knocks at exactly 12:07 a.m., often accompanied by soft whispers calling their names. Those who answered the door, the story claimed, were never seen again. Some of the reports described a pale figure standing on the porch, its face indistinct, sometimes blurred, sometimes just a shadow. Others insisted it was a spirit, a being that fed on fear, or a curse that lingered in the town like smoke in an abandoned chimney. I felt my stomach churn as I read, the hairs on my arms rising. It couldn't be real, could it? A local legend, surely, meant to scare children and gullible adults. Yet the details were too specific, too precise. Dates, addresses, even names were listed. And worst of all, the last reported encounter had been just a few streets away from my own house, almost 60 years ago. I left the library with a stack of clippings and notes, my mind racing. The sky outside had darkened into that deep, unnatural blue of early nightfall. Even the familiar street felt different now, heavy with unseen eyes and unspoken threats. I clutched my bag tightly and hurried home, desperate to make sense of what I had learned before nightfall swallowed everything. Back at the house, I locked the doors and double-checked the windows. The sunlight had faded entirely, leaving a pale glow that did little to comfort me. I read through the articles again, each word twisting into dread. Every story followed the same pattern, a knock at 12:07, a whispered name, and the disappearance of whoever had answered. Nobody ever returned. Sometimes neighbors reported hearing faint, indecipherable voices afterward. Sometimes there were signs of a struggle, sometimes nothing at all. The pattern was undeniable. And I couldn't escape the sinking realization, the knock was coming for me. I didn't just feel fear anymore, I felt inevitability. The clock would strike 12:07, the sound would echo, and I would be forced to make a choice I wasn't sure I could survive. I spent the evening preparing. I moved the furniture away from the door, set up lights along the hallway, and even placed my phone within reach, though I knew calling anyone might be useless. The house had its own rules at night, and I was beginning to understand that it didn't care for conventional help. I kept the curtains drawn and listened to every sound, the groan of the floorboards, the whisper of the wind through the trees, even the distant bark of a dog down the street. Every noise could be a warning, every shadow a threat. As the minutes ticked closer to midnight, I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. I tried to focus on my breathing, to stay calm, but it was no use. The air itself seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, pressing down on my shoulders, making it harder to think. My eyes kept darting to the clock, 11:55. 11:56. 11:57. At exactly 12:07, it happened. Knock. 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 The sound was louder than ever, reverberating through the house as though the door itself had become a drum. My heart jumped into my throat. And then I heard it, the whisper. My name, clear and deliberate, curling through the air like smoke. "You're here." I froze, unable to move. The flashlight in my hand trembled violently, casting long, jittering shadows across the walls. My mind raced, trying to think, to rationalize, to remember the warnings in the clippings. Do not answer. Do not open the door. Never. But it wasn't just a knock or a whisper this time. There was a presence. Something on the porch, just beyond the glass, waiting. I could feel it in the way the air had shifted, heavy and suffocating, pressing against my chest. My instincts screamed to run, but my legs refused to obey. I stood there, paralyzed by the combination of fear and disbelief, unable to move, unable to breathe. Hours, or maybe seconds, time had lost meaning, passed. I don't know how long I stayed there, but eventually the sound ceased. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, and the house settled around me once more. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, staring at the door, listening to every sound, every shift of the house, every whisper of wind outside. By dawn, I was exhausted, my mind frayed, but one thing was clear: I couldn't ignore it anymore. The midnight visitor wasn't a story. It wasn't a warning meant for amusement. It was real, and it had chosen me. And I didn't know how much longer I could survive the nights to come. I had convinced myself that understanding the legend would somehow protect me. Knowledge was power, or so I had told myself all day, scrolling through the newspaper clippings and old town records again and again. But as night fell, I realized that knowledge alone was useless. Understanding the midnight visitor did not mean I could stop it. It only meant I could anticipate it, and anticipating it made the dread heavier, sharper, as if I were carrying a stone in my chest that pressed down the closer midnight came. I tried to distract myself in the evening. I cooked dinner, read a few pages from a novel, and even put on music, hoping that the soft, familiar sounds would keep the house from closing in on me. For a little while, it worked. I hummed along, my voice trembling slightly, and the minutes ticked by without incident. But the clock loomed, looming larger with every passing second. It was impossible to escape. I found myself pacing the hallway, the flashlight clutched in one hand like a lifeline. Each creak of the floorboards beneath my feet felt magnified, a warning, a countdown. My eyes flicked constantly to the door, which seemed to absorb the dim light of the room, turning it into a black, empty void. I could feel my heart hammering, each beat echoing in my ears. I told myself to breathe, to calm down, but panic was a tide I couldn't resist. Then it came. Knock. 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 Louder than before, sharper than ever, each rap reverberating through the door like the strike of a hammer. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight, my knees shaking so violently I could barely stand. And then I heard it, the whisper. My name, drawn out, low, deliberate. You're here. But there was something different this time. Beneath the whisper, something else moved in the darkness, a subtle shifting, a scraping sound just beyond the glass. I froze, straining to listen. It was there again, the faintest of movements, almost imperceptible, like a slow footstep, or maybe a hand dragging along the porch floor. Fear made me stupidly brave. I edged closer to the door, pressing my palm against the cold surface. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed, pale, every nerve on fire. I wanted to scream, to run, to throw myself into the streets and never return. But something held me there, rooted, as if the house itself was forcing me to confront it. I yanked the curtain aside and shone the flashlight onto the porch. Nothing. The figure was gone. The street was empty, still bathed in the pale glow of the moon. The scraping had stopped, and only the wind moved through the trees. I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to calm my racing heartbeat, trying to convince myself I had imagined it all. But I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. I could feel it in every nerve ending, in the way the air had pressed down against my body, in the unmistakable weight of its presence just beyond the door. After a few long minutes, I forced myself to back away, retreating into the living room. My hands shook as I locked the door again, checked the windows, even reinforced the deadbolt. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. I could lock, barricade, plead, or pray, and it would still come. I had seen too much, heard too much, and survived too little. Sleep was impossible. I tried to lie in bed, flashlight at my side, but my mind refused to calm. Every creak, every groan of the house made me flinch. I felt as if the walls themselves were closing in, leaning over me, whispering my name over and over, though I knew it was only my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed. Time seemed meaningless. The house existed only in darkness, only in the shadowed corner of fear I could not escape. I wanted dawn more than anything, to see the sun rise, to feel warmth and normality again. But even as the first faint streaks of light touched the horizon, the knowledge remained, the knocks would come again. The whispers would return. And next time, they might not be content to wait outside the door. By morning, I was exhausted beyond reason. My hands shook, my muscles ached, and my mind felt frayed, raw. I had survived another night, but it was only survival. I could feel the weight of what was coming, the inevitability that the midnight visitor wasn't done with me yet. And I knew, in a way that chilled me to the core, that it would only grow bolder, more insistent, the next time it came. By the morning after the fourth night, I was no longer sure I could trust my own senses. I had survived the knocks again, the whispers again, but the house had begun to feel different. Heavier, somehow, like it was holding its breath, waiting. For the first time, I noticed things that weren't there before, small details that felt wrong in ways I couldn't explain. At first, I tried to brush them off as sleep deprivation or paranoia. But as the day wore on, I realized I could no longer ignore them. Something was inside the house. The first sign was subtle. I had gone to the kitchen to make coffee, and the sugar container wasn't on the counter where I had left it. I swore I had set it down next to the jar of tea the night before, but it was now near the edge of the sink, tilted slightly. I froze, staring at it, trying to convince myself I had moved it and forgotten. But the nagging unease in my stomach told me otherwise. My hands trembled as I returned it to its original place, my mind racing. Later, as I walked through the living room, I noticed the cushions on the couch had shifted. I was certain I had left them perfectly aligned the night before. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I must have nudged them in my sleep, though the idea made no sense. I had slept with the lights on, curled up in a chair with the flashlight at my side. Nobody else was here, or so I told myself. The most unnerving sign, however, came from the hallway leading to the front door. I had left my shoes neatly by the door when I went to bed, yet now they were scattered, as if someone had been trying them on, pacing back and forth. My stomach twisted at the thought. The locks were intact. No windows had been opened. No one could have entered. And yet, something, or someone, had been here. I tried to rationalize, to cling to normality, but the air in the house had changed. It was heavier, as though the very walls were pressing down on me. Shadows seemed darker, longer, stretching in ways that defied the moonlight. Every sound, the fridge humming, the creak of the stairs, even the wind rustling outside, felt amplified, almost purposeful. It was as if the house itself was aware of my fear and feeding it back to me, layer by layer. When night fell, I did everything I could to prepare. I moved the furniture closer together, placed the flashlight within arm's reach, and kept the doors locked, triple-checked. I set up a small recording device in the living room, thinking that maybe if something entered, I could catch it on tape. My hands shook as I positioned it, and I cursed myself for being so paranoid, but instinct had taken over. I had to know. The clock crawled toward midnight. I sat in the living room, knees pulled up to my chest, eyes flicking constantly toward the door. The minutes seemed to stretch, elongated by fear. And then, as if on cue, it began. Knock. 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 3 raps, heavy, deliberate. Louder than ever, reverberating through the floorboards, shaking my chest. My hands gripped the flashlight like a lifeline. And then, the whisper. Low, slow, deliberate. My name. I froze. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but I was rooted in place. The weight of the house pressed against me, and I realized with a shiver that the knocks were no longer confined to the door. Something was moving inside. The sugar, the cushions, the shoes, they weren't random accidents. The presence had crossed the threshold, though I hadn't heard it. I felt it. Every instinct screamed that it was closer now, watching me, waiting. A sound came from the kitchen, soft scraping, like fingernails against the counter. I spun toward it, the flashlight shaking violently in my hand. Nothing was there, only the faint silver glow of moonlight reflecting off the countertops. My breath came in shallow bursts, my chest tight. I wanted to flee, but my legs refused to obey. I was trapped in my own house, under its oppressive silence, with the knowledge that whatever was inside could do anything it wanted, unseen and unchallenged. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had lost meaning. Every creak, every whisper of wind, every shadow felt like it belonged to something alive and conscious, following me, anticipating my next move. I stayed in the living room, huddled beneath a blanket, flashlight clutched to my chest, listening to every sound, praying I would survive the night. By dawn, I had counted every item in the kitchen twice, lined up the shoes along the hallway, and straightened every cushion. But I knew it would return. Every night it returned, growing bolder, more invasive. And I could feel it, an invisible presence in every corner of the house, pressing in, whispering, testing me. I realized then, fully and undeniably, that the midnight visitor was no longer limited to knocking at the door. It had found a way in, a way to occupy my home, my space, my life. And with every night, every knock, every whisper, it was making itself more real, more powerful, until I feared that soon there would be nothing left of the house, or of me. By the fifth night, I was exhausted beyond measure. Sleep had become a distant memory, replaced with hours of tense waiting, my nerves stretched so thin they felt ready to snap at the slightest sound. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind, made my heart leap. I had prepared as best I could, doors locked, windows reinforced, flashlight in hand, and the recording device running. But deep down, I knew preparation was useless. Knowledge of the legend had not protected me. It had only made me more aware of what was coming, and what was coming was inevitable. The evening had passed in a blur of anxious pacing and futile distractions. I had tried reading, but the words blurred on the page. I had tried cooking, but the smell of food barely registered. I had even tried talking to myself, as if uttering words aloud could anchor me to reality, but my voice sounded strange in the stillness, distant, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. And now the clock crept toward midnight, each tick a drumbeat of impending terror. At exactly 12:07, it happened. Knock. 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 Louder, sharper, more insistent than ever before. My heart jumped into my throat. My hands shook as I clutched the flashlight, nearly dropping it. And then, faintly beneath the knocks, I heard the whisper. My name, drawn out and deliberate, curling through the air like smoke. I froze, paralyzed with fear. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was outside the door, waiting, observing, testing me. I approached the door, flashlight trembling violently in my hand. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide, to do anything other than confront what I already knew awaited me. But something compelled me forward, a mixture of dread and a need to see the truth. Slowly, I raised the curtain and peered through the narrow window. And there it was. A figure stood on the porch, pale and thin, its features obscured by shadow, but its presence undeniable. I could feel the weight of its gaze, cold and deliberate, pressing through the glass and into my chest. The eyes, or what I assumed were eyes, were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull the light out of the world around them. Its mouth was a faint, impossible smile, a curve that was too wide, too unnatural to be human. And it was staring directly at me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, my breath ragged, my mind screaming for reason. How could it be here? The door was locked. The locks were secure. There was no possible way for someone to appear like that. And yet, there it was, real, present, and watching me. I tried to rationalize, tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the street lamp or the reflection of the moon. But I knew better. The presence was alive, sentient, malevolent. I could feel it in my bones, in the hair standing on the back of my neck, in the icy fingers of fear that wrapped around my chest. Then, without a sound, the figure moved closer, or at least I thought it did. Its shape seemed to blur, the shadows around it twisting, stretching toward me. I pressed my hand against the curtain, my knuckles white, and tried to force myself to step away. But I couldn't. Something rooted me to the spot, a mixture of terror and fascination that left me powerless. I don't know how long I stared, paralyzed, watching the impossible figure on my porch. Minutes felt like hours. My mind raced with questions I knew I would never answer. Who, or what, was this? Why me? How could it exist beyond the laws of reality? And most terrifying of all, what would happen if I opened the door? I didn't have to find out. The figure remained outside, silent except for the faint echo of its presence. My flashlight flickered in my hands, and I felt a shiver run through me as the shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward it, as if acknowledging its dominance over this space. Then, almost imperceptibly, it stepped back, fading into the darkness of the porch, leaving me alone once more. I backed away from the door, my legs trembling, heart pounding so violently I feared it would burst. I stumbled into the living room, collapsing into the chair, flashlight still clutched in my hand. My mind refused to settle, replaying the vision over and over. The figure was real. I had seen it. There was no explanation, no rationalization, only the undeniable truth. The midnight visitor was no longer a story, no longer a legend. It was here. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the door, listening for the faintest sound, every nerve on fire. The house felt different now, heavier, more oppressive, as though it had absorbed the visitor's presence and refused to let it go. Every shadow seemed alive, every creak of the floorboards a warning. I tried not to think about what would happen if it returned, or if it tried to come inside, but my mind refused to be still. By morning, I was drained, hollowed out by the terror of the night. I tried to eat, to drink coffee, to bring myself back to some semblance of reality, but the image of the figure on my porch lingered, etched into my memory. Its hollow gaze, its impossible smile, the way it moved without sound, these were things that could not be unseen. I realized then, with a cold, sinking certainty, that my nights had only just begun. The midnight visitor had revealed itself, and by doing so, it had made its intentions clear. It wasn't just knocking anymore. It was watching. Waiting. Learning. And I was trapped in a house that had become a hunting ground. By the 9th night, I had stopped pretending that I could fight this. Every preparation, every precaution, every attempt to rationalize the midnight visitor's presence had failed. The knocks no longer felt like warnings, they were promises. Each rap of the door, each whisper of my name, had become a countdown I could feel in my bones. My body ached from sleepless nights, my hands were constantly trembling, and my mind teetered on the edge of collapse. I had survived this long, yes, but survival had come at the cost of my sanity. The evening passed in a blur of fear and futile distraction. I barely ate, barely moved, and barely spoke. I kept the lights on, the television running, and the flashlight within reach at all times. Every sound in the house felt magnified, the creak of the stairs, the hum of the refrigerator, even the wind brushing against the windows. Every shadow seemed alive, stretching, reaching, mocking me. And all the while, I knew the moment would come. At exactly 12:07, it began. Knock. 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 The sound was deafening in the quiet of the house. It rattled the walls, shook the floorboards, and made my chest throb painfully. And then came the whisper. My name, drawn out, low, deliberate, reverberating through the air like smoke curling around my very bones. You're here. I approached the door, hands trembling violently. My flashlight flickered in my grip as I stared through the narrow window. And there it was, the figure, pale, thin, impossibly still, and staring directly at me. Its hollow eyes seemed to reach inside me, stripping away every layer of fear, every shred of hope, every vestige of sanity I had clung to. The smile was there again, faint and unnatural, curling impossibly across its face. I felt my knees weaken, my body threatening to collapse under the weight of its gaze. I couldn't look away. Something about its presence demanded my attention, drawing me forward despite every instinct screaming to flee. I could feel it moving, though its form remained fixed, a paradox that made my skin crawl. The air around the door was heavy, charged, vibrating with a malevolence I could feel in my chest, in my throat, in the marrow of my bones. Then, almost imperceptibly, the figure shifted. Its head tilted, its hollow gaze never leaving mine. I realized with a sickening clarity that it wasn't just observing me anymore. It was waiting for me to respond, to act, to acknowledge its claim. I wanted to scream, to shut the door, to hide under the bed and pray it would leave me, but my body refused. I was frozen, captivated, helpless. Knock. 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 The raps were insistent now, urgent, almost angry. The whisper followed, louder, closer, as if pressed directly into my ear. Open the door. You answered. You belong to me. I stumbled backward, hands fumbling for something, anything to defend myself. But there was nothing. The visitor had no tangible form I could fight, no weakness I could exploit. It was a presence, a force, a predator that existed outside reason and beyond the laws of reality. My mind screamed for logic, for an explanation, but none came. There was only fear, raw and absolute, and the knowledge that it would not stop until it had its due. Then, as I stood there, trembling, paralyzed by terror, I noticed something new. The shadows around the room were stretching, moving toward the door, almost as if the house itself was aware, acknowledging the visitor's presence. The air felt thick, like water, pressing against my chest, filling my lungs, making it harder to breathe. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, loud enough that I feared it might summon the figure closer. I knew, in that moment, that I had reached the end of my options. Every barricade, every lock, every preparation had been meaningless. The midnight visitor had arrived, fully present, and the final knock had come. I didn't have the strength to resist, and I didn't know if resistance would have mattered. And then it stopped. Silence figure was but still, its hollow gaze fixed on the floor. The air slowly began to shift, and oppressively lifted just slightly. My legs gave way, and I sank to the floor, gasping, shaking, trying to comprehend what it was. The visitor was still there, but the assaulted ones and whispers and cries, even only its impossible, unnatural presence. I realized then that the movement of visitor's patience was not normal. It had marked me, tested me, and made its power under me. I did not know what it would do next, or when it would act. But I knew this, the final moment, the rapid survival, was only there. The house was no longer safe, the night no longer awake, and the terror I endured was only the beginning of everything happening. By God, I was hollowed out, exhausted, and trembling, my mind frayed at the edges. The knocks and whispers had left their mark, and I knew the visitor would return, more insistent, more daring, more impossible to ignore. I had glimpsed it fully, and now I understood that there was no escape, only survival, and even survival felt like a cruel, fleeting victory. By the 10th morning, exhaustion had stripped me down to a hollow version of myself. My eyes were bloodshot, my muscles ached, and my mind felt like it was fraying at every edge. The events of the previous night, the final knock, the hollow stare, the unnatural presence, played over and over in my thoughts. It was no longer possible to pretend that the midnight visitor was a story, a figment of imagination, or a prank. It was real, and its power was undeniable. As the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to piece together the scattered fragments of my thoughts. The knocks were not random. The whispers were not idle. There was a method, a purpose behind them that I had yet to understand. And with that realization came a chilling understanding. The visitor was not just observing anymore, it was learning. Every night it adapted, growing bolder, testing boundaries, studying me as if I were a puzzle it intended to solve. I went over every event, every shift in the house. The sugar jar moved, the cushions shifted, the shoes scattered across the hallway. These were not accidents. They were signs, deliberate manipulations meant to destabilize me, to wear me down. And now I understood something far more terrifying. The visitor's true strength was patience. It could wait, it could watch, it could strike only when it saw fit. And it had all the time in the world. The realization hit me with a crushing weight. I was trapped in my own home, at the mercy of a being I could not see, could not touch, and could not reason with. The house itself had become part of its domain, complicit in its power, amplifying fear, heightening tension, bending reality to its will. I felt the oppressive presence even in the daylight, faint but undeniable, lingering in corners, sliding along walls, hiding in shadows that moved when I wasn't looking. I tried to make sense of it, delving back into the newspaper clippings and diaries I had collected over the previous nights. The midnight visitor had a pattern. It was always drawn to fear, to those who responded, to those who acknowledged its presence. Its victims were never random, it sought engagement, a recognition of its dominion. That was the common thread in every story. And the horrifying part was the final, unspoken rule. Once the visitor had marked someone, there was no escaping it. No doors, no locks, no barricades could protect them. It would wait, silently, invisibly, until it claimed what it wanted. A cold chill ran through me. The implication was undeniable. I had already been marked. By answering, by acknowledging it, by surviving the first knocks and whispers, I had drawn its attention fully to myself. There would be no reprieve, no mercy. Every night would escalate, every encounter would intensify, until I had nothing left to give. I realized, with a sinking horror, that survival was no longer enough. Survival would become a torment, each night a sharpened blade cutting deeper into my mind, my body, my soul. The weight of this realization made me feel sick. I thought about leaving, running far away, abandoning the house. But I knew it would follow me. Its reach was not limited to the house, I was beginning to understand. The legend suggested that once it had chosen a person, proximity was irrelevant. It could strike wherever its victim went, patiently, relentlessly. Escape was an illusion. I was trapped, not just physically, but spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. By mid-morning, I was exhausted and trembling, consumed by fear and understanding. I had glimpsed the visitor's nature, and I knew the stakes had grown higher than I had ever imagined. It was no longer a simple haunting. It was a predator, and I was its prey. The house had become a trap, a cage that it controlled, and my nights had become a battlefield I could not hope to win. I spent the rest of the day preparing as best I could, though preparation now felt almost futile. I fortified doors, double-checked locks, arranged furniture to give myself some sense of control, and kept my flashlight and phone at hand. But deep down, I knew that no preparation could alter the truth. The midnight visitor was coming back tonight, stronger, more insistent, closer than ever. And I would have to face it once more. As evening approached, I felt the oppressive weight returning, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Shadows seemed to thicken, the air grew colder, and the silence was heavier than it had ever been. I could feel the visitor drawing near even before it arrived, an invisible hand pressing against my chest, constricting, testing, reminding me of its dominance. When the clock edged closer to 12:07, my pulse hammered, my hands trembled, and my breath came in shallow, frantic gasps. I knew I would hear the knocks again, the whispers again. And this time, I understood, fully and irrevocably, the visitor would not relent. It would push, it would prod, it would escalate until the final confrontation came. I sat in the living room, flashlight in hand, heart racing, staring at the front door, trying to summon courage. I tried to prepare my mind for what was coming, to steel myself against the inevitable terror. But knowledge was a double-edged sword. Understanding the visitor's nature gave me clarity, yes, but it also stripped away the comfort of ignorance. I could see the shape of the nightmare that awaited me, and it was larger, darker, and more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The minutes dragged. Each tick of the clock was a drumbeat of doom. And when 12:07 finally arrived, I was ready, or as ready as I could be. The knocks began, sharp and insistent, followed immediately by the whisper of my name. I felt the presence pressing into the room, unseen but undeniable, circling me, testing me, asserting control. And as I faced the coming night, I realized one terrible truth: the midnight visitor was not just a force outside the door anymore. It had become part of the house, part of the night, part of my life. And it would not stop until it had claimed me fully. By the 11th night, I no longer thought of the midnight visitor as an external threat. It had become intrinsic to the house itself. Every corner, every shadow, every creak of the floorboards felt alive with its presence. I could feel it moving even when my eyes were closed, circling, pressing, whispering. The air had grown heavier, charged with an unnatural tension, as though the darkness itself had been weaponized against me. My sense of safety, once fragile but present, had vanished entirely. I spent the evening trying futile distractions, reading, watching television, even pacing the hallway in hopes that movement would help stave off panic. But nothing worked. The walls seemed to contract, the shadows stretching unnaturally, reaching toward me like fingers. I realized with sinking horror that the visitor's influence had grown. It was no longer content with waiting or knocking, it was asserting its dominion over the environment. The house had become its instrument, and I was merely a witness to the unfolding nightmare. As midnight approached, the oppressive energy intensified. My hands shook violently, the flashlight in my grip flickering, shadows dancing across the walls. Then, at exactly 12:07, the first knock came. Knock. 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 It was louder than ever, reverberating through the walls and floorboards. My pulse raced, my chest tightened, and I knew instantly that this night would be different. And it was. Almost immediately, the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, coalesce, forming shapes that were darker than the rest of the darkness. I could see them stretching, writhing, elongating, as though reaching toward me with impossible intent. The whisper followed, faint at first, then louder, more insistent: "You cannot hide. You belong." I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it trembled as I whispered back, "I'm not yours. Leave me alone." The air thickened around me, and suddenly, one of the shadows moved independently. It extended, stretching toward my feet, twisting and curling like smoke. I recoiled in terror, trying to step back, but the shadow slid along the floor, blocking my path, curling up my legs, cold and suffocating. My breath caught in my throat as I realized this wasn't just imagination. The visitor's power was manifesting physically, bending the darkness to its will. I tried to shine the flashlight on the shadows, but they absorbed the light, turning it into deeper darkness. Every attempt to illuminate them made no difference. They were part of the night itself, part of the oppressive weight that pressed down on me. The room felt smaller, constricting, as though the walls themselves were bending toward me, enclosing me in a cage constructed entirely of shadows and fear. The knocks grew more urgent, now echoing not only from the front door but from every wall, every surface. I could hear them in the living room, in the hallway, even from the ceiling above. The whisper followed from every direction, my name repeated in a low, insistent chant, almost like a heartbeat synchronized with the pounding of my own chest. Panic surged, overwhelming me. I wanted to run, to hide, to escape into the streets, but my body refused to cooperate. My legs felt rooted to the floor, my muscles paralyzed by terror. The shadows stretched further, reaching, twisting, growing in size and menace. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down, as if it had become a vessel for the visitor's will. I sank to the floor, flashlight still clutched to my chest, and tried to steady my breath. Every instinct screamed at me to surrender, to open the door and face whatever it wanted, but I could not. Resistance was futile, yet submission felt impossible. The shadows began to swirl around me, a vortex of darkness that seemed to pull at my mind, urging me to give in, to let it claim me fully. Time lost all meaning. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours. The knocks and whispers continued without pause. The shadows writhed, twisting in ways that defied physics, enveloping the room in an ever-tightening spiral of fear. I realized with horror that the visitor's power had grown beyond simple haunting. It could now manipulate reality itself within the house, turning everyday objects, walls, and shadows into instruments of terror. I screamed, a raw, desperate sound that seemed to echo into nothingness. The shadows recoiled slightly at the noise, but only briefly, before resuming their slow, deliberate advance. My mind raced, trying to remember the old legends, trying to recall any method of resistance, any trick that could protect me. But nothing came. Knowledge offered no solution. Preparation offered no solace. I was alone, trapped in the house, at the mercy of a force that had no limits. And then, almost imperceptibly, the weight of the darkness shifted. The shadows began to recede, withdrawing back into the corners of the room, leaving me trembling, gasping, and broken on the floor. The knocks ceased. The whispers faded into a low hum that seemed to vibrate in my bones rather than my ears. For the first time in hours, I could breathe. But the reprieve was hollow. I knew that this night had changed something fundamental. The visitor's power was no longer confined to observation or simple manipulation. It could bend the environment itself, twisting shadows, air, and light into instruments of terror. And it had learned, adapted, grown stronger from each encounter. I understood, with bone-deep certainty, that the nights ahead would escalate even further, that nothing in my world would ever be ordinary again. By dawn, I was hollowed, exhausted, and trembling. The house was silent, but the shadows lingered, faint and watchful. The visitor had not left, it had merely retreated, waiting for the next opportunity. And I realized with a sinking dread that the night of shadows had only just begun, that the battle for my sanity, my home, and my very life was far from over. By the 12th night, I could no longer tolerate the suffocating presence of the midnight visitor. Each knock, each whisper, each subtle movement within the house had chipped away at what remained of my sanity. I had tried barricades, preparations, reasoning, even endurance, but nothing worked. The visitor had grown stronger, bolder, more insistent, and I knew I had only one option left: I had to leave. I had to escape this house, this prison, this nightmare, before it claimed me completely. The plan formed in my mind during the dim light of evening. I would leave quietly, pack a few essentials, and disappear into the night. I would drive far away, go to a motel, anywhere beyond the reach of the house and its malevolent occupant. For the first time in days, I allowed myself a flicker of hope. Escape was the only chance I had left, and I clung to it like a lifeline. I moved through the house cautiously, flashlight in hand, packing clothes and supplies. Every sound made me jump: the creak of a floorboard, the scrape of the wind against the window, the hum of the refrigerator. I tried to move as silently as possible, but I felt a weight in the air, a subtle pressure that made my skin crawl. It was as if the visitor knew, felt, and anticipated every movement I made. By 11:50, everything was ready. I had packed a small bag, my phone fully charged, and my car keys in my hand. The house was silent, too silent, every shadow long and watchful. I took a deep breath and approached the front door. My hands shook so violently I could barely turn the doorknob. I told myself this was it. Tonight I would leave, tonight I would reclaim my life, tonight I would escape. Then the first knock came. Knock. 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 It was louder than ever, rattling the door, resonating through the floorboards, echoing in my chest. My stomach dropped, my pulse surged, and I froze in place. The whisper followed, low and deliberate, curling around me, going somewhere? I tried to ignore it, forcing my hands to turn the knob, but the door didn't move. It was as if the visitor had anchored it in place, bending the world to its will. Panic surged. I tried to push, to kick, to shove, but the door was immovable. The locks were no longer the barrier they had been. The visitor had removed their effectiveness, replaced them with its power. I realized, with a sickening certainty, that escape was not as simple as walking out. The air in the house thickened, charged with a malevolent energy that pressed down on my chest, constricting my breathing. Shadows twisted and shifted, moving toward me, coiling around the hallway and staircase. I could feel their weight, the oppressive force of their presence, pushing me back into the living room. My legs gave way, and I stumbled, nearly collapsing onto the floor. I tried to shout, to call for help, but the sound caught in my throat. The whispers escalated, circling me, repeating my name over and over, a chant that seemed to vibrate inside my skull. The shadows moved faster now, curling along the walls, twisting into forms that defied comprehension, blocking my path. I understood then with crushing clarity that the visitor had anticipated my attempt. It had been waiting, patient, knowing I would eventually try to flee, and now it had me exactly where it wanted. I sank to my knees, flashlight clutched tightly to my chest, trying to maintain focus, trying to think. The shadows writhed around me, stretching closer, curling toward my limbs. I could feel the cold, impossible touch of them brushing against my skin, chilling me to the bone. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I realized I was trapped, not just physically but mentally, spiritually, completely. I tried to reason with it, whispering into the thick darkness, "I don't want to fight you. I just want to leave." The response was immediate, in the form of a cold, omnipresent pressure that pressed down on me from every direction. The knocks resumed, rapid and insistent, echoing in the house like a drumbeat of doom. The whisper followed, "You cannot leave. You belong." Tears streamed down my face. I understood finally, fully, that there was no escape. The house was no longer mine. The visitor had claimed it, and with it, claimed me. Every ounce of hope I had clung to vanished like smoke. The air itself felt alive, bending and twisting, guiding me back into the shadows that now dominated every corner of the room. I could feel my mind fraying, panic clawing at every thought. The shadows seemed to mock me, swirling faster, pressing closer, feeding on my terror. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in almost total darkness. I was enveloped completely, the weight of the visitor pressing down, suffocating, asserting dominance over every part of my being. And then, in the midst of my despair, I realized something horrifying. The visitor did not need to act physically. It controlled the house, the air, the shadows. It controlled perception itself. Escape was impossible not because of walls or doors, but because it had claimed the space and the reality itself. I was ensnared, trapped within a nightmare that had no boundaries. By the first light of dawn, I was slumped against the wall, trembling, broken, and utterly defeated. My escape attempt had failed. The house remained silent, the shadows withdrawn but ever watchful, as if waiting for the next night, the next knock, the next whisper. I knew, with absolute certainty, that the visitor would return, stronger, more insistent, and closer than ever. I had learned a bitter truth: the midnight visitor did not need to knock to terrify, did not need to appear to control, did not need to strike to dominate. It existed Bayo. By the 13th night, I could feel the weight of inevitability pressing down on me. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind, every shadow that shifted slightly against the wall had become a reminder. The midnight visitor was patient, unyielding, and relentless. Escape had failed. The house had claimed me. Even the thought of leaving now made my chest tighten with hopelessness. It was no longer just a haunting, it was an invasion, a siege, a rule that I had no power to resist. I decided, with a desperate clarity, that I needed to isolate myself. One room, barricaded, fortified against the invisible predator that prowled the house. The living room had been no sanctuary. The hallway offered no comfort. Even the bedroom, once my place of sleep and temporary refuge, had become just another playground for the visitor. I chose the study, the smallest room in the house, with thick walls and no windows. It had a single door, which I reinforced with every piece of furniture I could move: chairs, desks, bookshelves. I stacked them in layers, blocking any conceivable entry. The act of barricading itself was exhausting. Each movement was accompanied by a sense of dread, as if the house itself resisted my efforts, conspiring with the visitor to mock me. Chairs scraped across the floorboards with unnerving echoes. Books fell, hitting the hardwood with sharp thuds. Every sound made me flinch, every shadow made me jump, but I pressed on. By the time I finished, the study looked like a fortress, a desperate attempt at safety in a world that no longer obeyed logic. I sat in the middle of the room, flashlight on the floor beside me, bag of essentials clutched to my chest. Silence enveloped me, thick and almost tangible, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope. Perhaps this would be enough. Perhaps the visitor would knock at the door, see the barricade, and retreat. Perhaps, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, I might survive a night without fear. But that hope was fragile, and I knew it. My heart pounded as the minutes crawled by. The air felt thicker, heavier, almost like it was vibrating with the presence of something unseen. And then, without warning, it began. Knock. 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 The sound came from the door, resonating through the walls of the study, rattling the furniture I had so painstakingly arranged. My stomach dropped, a cold lump of terror settling in my chest. The knocks were slower at first, deliberate, testing, and then faster, insistent, like a heartbeat echoing in the confined space. My pulse surged. I gripped my bag tighter, my knuckles white, and whispered to myself, "Stay calm. It's just a sound. It's just a sound." But the whispers followed almost immediately, curling around the barricade, pressing into my mind. "You cannot hide. You belong." I froze, heart hammering. The voice was low, deliberate, omnipresent, as if it emanated from the walls themselves. I had heard the whispers before, but never this close, never this intense. The visitor had adapted again, learned again. It had found a way to reach me even behind layers of wood and books and furniture. The shadows in the room shifted. At first, I thought it was the flickering of the flashlight, but soon I realized they moved independently, writhing, stretching along the walls and ceiling, forming shapes too fluid, too deliberate to be mere tricks of light. They stretched closer, undulating in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, crawling toward me with the inevitability of a tide. My breath caught in my throat. I was trapped, entirely, with nowhere to run. Then I felt it. The air itself pressed in on me, cold and sharp, as if invisible hands had found me, wrapping around my shoulders, constricting my chest. I tried to push back, to rise, to step away, but my legs refused to obey. The study had become a cage, and I was pinned at the center, entirely exposed. Every instinct screamed to fight, to flee, to scream, but all I could do was huddle in the middle of the room, shaking, listening to the knocks and whispers escalate. The door itself began to vibrate. The furniture groaned under a pressure I couldn't explain. I realized, with sickening clarity, that the visitor didn't need to physically pass through the barricade. It had already claimed the room, bending reality itself, moving objects, altering shadows, manipulating the very air. It was inside my sanctuary without stepping over the threshold. The shadows stretched closer, curling along the walls, twisting around the stacks of furniture I had used as barricades. I could feel them pressing in, like invisible fingers brushing against my skin, probing, testing, asserting dominance over every inch of space. I tried to shine the flashlight on them, but the light seemed to bend around the darkness, absorbed and warped until the room felt darker than before. Panic surged like fire through my chest. The visitor's presence was now undeniable, omnipresent, and impossible to ignore. I pressed my back against the wall, my knees drawn up to my chest, clutching my bag and flashlight like talismans. The whispers continued, low and insistent, repeating my name over and over. But now there were other sounds, subtle at first, a dragging along the floor, a scraping from the ceiling, a faint tapping inside the walls themselves. I realized with dread that the visitor had found a way to manipulate not only the shadows but the physical space around me. Every object in the room felt alive, subtly moving toward me, guided by an unseen hand. Then the temperature dropped. Cold seeped into my bones, sharper than any winter wind I had ever felt. My breath fogged in front of me, and I shivered violently. The shadows writhed faster, almost eagerly, as if responding to the fear radiating from me. I realized with a sinking horror that the visitor fed on my terror, grew stronger with every heartbeat that pounded in panic. I tried to calm myself, tried to take control, but my thoughts were scattered, shredded by the oppressive presence surrounding me. The door rattled violently. My makeshift barricades shook, groaned under the pressure, as though the walls themselves were bending to the will of the visitor. I shouted, desperate, "Stop! Leave me alone!" There was no response, only the oppressive silence punctuated by whispers, now layered over each other, echoing from every corner, "You cannot leave. You belong. You belong. You belong." I realized then, fully, that isolation had failed. The study was no sanctuary. The room, the furniture, the walls, even the air itself had been claimed. I was not hiding from the visitor, I was trapped inside the center of its power. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness so complete it felt suffocating. Every shadow in the room became alive, curling, stretching, pressing, writhing. My mind screamed for relief, for some sign that this would end, but there was none. I could feel it now, closer than ever. The temperature dropped further, frost forming along the edges of the furniture, the walls, the floor. My fingers froze where they gripped the bag. I could hear it breathing, or was it me, a low, cold exhalation that vibrated through the very floorboards. Then a sound I will never forget, the creak of the ceiling above me bending, as if a weight had pressed on it. My heart stopped. Something unseen shifted above, stretching downward, the shadows moving with it, creating shapes that defied comprehension. I sank fully to the floor, hugging my knees, trying to make myself small, trying to make myself invisible. I could feel the air tighten around my chest, constricting, suffocating, as if the visitor was drawing strength from my fear. The whispers intensified, overlapping and multiplying, forming a chorus of voices calling my name, reminding me that I was trapped. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with intent, breathing with the presence of something beyond natural, something that had claimed this house and was claiming me. I could feel time stretching. Minutes became hours. Every second was punctuated by subtle movements, small whispers, the scraping of shadows along the floor. My mind teetered on the brink of collapse. And then, almost imperceptibly, the shadows paused. Silence fell like a weight pressing into my skull. The temperature remained cold, oppressive, and I could feel the presence lingering, waiting. 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 I realized with a sickening clarity that tonight had changed the rules. The visitor had escalated. Isolation, barricades, preparation, they were meaningless. I was no longer facing an external threat, I was in the center of its domain. It could reach me anywhere, manipulate anything, bend reality around me. And now I understood, there was no escape, not in the house, not outside it, not even in my own mind. As dawn approached, the shadows withdrew slightly, leaving me trembling, exhausted, and hollow. The whispers faded but left a residue, a lingering knowledge of the power surrounding me. I had survived the night, yes, but I was irreparably changed. The locked room had offered no sanctuary. It had offered only the illusion of control, and I had learned the most terrifying truth of all: the visitor's reach was absolute. Every night would escalate. Every night would challenge me further. And I would never be safe again. By morning, I lay on the floor, shivering, heart still hammering, knowing that the visitor was patient. It had learned, adapted, grown stronger, and tomorrow night it would return. And I, trapped, terrified, and hollow, would have no choice but to face it once more. By the 14th night, the line between reality and nightmare had completely blurred. I no longer questioned whether the midnight visitor was real, it had become undeniable. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the shadows, every whisper of my name made my chest tighten with fear. Sleep was no longer an option, the nights had become a battlefield, and my body a cage for the relentless force that now dominated my home. I had survived so far, but I knew the visitor had grown impatient. Earlier in the evening, I had attempted the same preparations I had done countless times before: barricades, lights, a flashlight and phone at arm's reach. Yet, despite my efforts, the oppressive air felt heavier than ever. It pressed down like a physical weight, almost tangible, as if the darkness itself had mass. I could feel it moving inside the house, circling silently, testing me, learning my patterns, anticipating every thought. And I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that tonight it would no longer remain just a presence. Tonight it would make itself tangible. At precisely 12:07, the first knock came. Knock. 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 Louder than ever. Resonating through the walls, the floorboards, the ceiling. My pulse spiked, my hands shaking as I gripped the flashlight. I whispered to myself, trying to summon courage, "It's just a sound. It's just a knock." But deep down, I knew the truth. The visitor had arrived. The shadows in the corners of the room began to thicken. At first, subtle, stretching across the floor and walls in unnatural shapes, and then more defined, almost solid. I could see a vague form emerging, a dark silhouette darker than the surrounding darkness, coalescing near the living room doorway. My heart pounded so violently I feared it might echo and summon the visitor closer. I wanted to look away, wanted to flee, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by both terror and fascination. Then it moved. Not like a human or animal. Not like a shadow cast by light. It slid across the floor, an impossible fluidity in its motion, bending around furniture, ignoring walls, defying the laws of physics. It stopped just beyond the edge of the doorway, its form now tall, thin, and vaguely humanoid, but every proportion wrong, every contour unnatural. And then I saw it, eyes. Deep, hollow, black voids that seemed to pull at the very air around them, sucking light, warmth, and hope. Its gaze found mine instantly, and I could feel it, not just in my eyes but in my chest, my bones, my very soul. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound, and stumbled backward. The figure responded not with sound but with presence. The temperature dropped so sharply I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The shadows around it shifted, forming claw-like extensions that reached toward me without moving, bending space in ways that made my stomach churn. I tried to flee, but my legs felt like lead. I was trapped, entirely, in the presence of something that had claimed not just my home, but my body and mind. It whispered my name, again and again, but this time with a resonance that was almost physical, vibrating through the floor, the walls, my very bones. You belong. You belong. You cannot escape. I stumbled, my flashlight dropping and rolling across the floor. Its beam fell on the figure, illuminating details that made my stomach twist: elongated limbs, impossible angles, a smile that curled unnaturally across its face. It was not solid, not entirely, but it had form. It existed in some terrifying in-between, half shadow, half presence, fully malevolent. And it was close, too close. I could feel its cold brushing against my skin, my hair, my clothes, without ever touching me. Desperation surged through me. I lunged toward the door, toward the escape I had attempted countless times before, but it was no use. The visitor was everywhere, bending the room, twisting the shadows, controlling the air. Even movement became a struggle, as if gravity itself resisted my attempts to flee. I tripped over a fallen chair, hitting the floor with a thud that echoed in the oppressive silence. It advanced, or appeared to, because the laws of motion seemed optional in its presence, until it was directly in front of me. I could feel the darkness pressing in from all sides. My lungs burned as I tried to scream, tried to fight, tried to resist. But resistance was meaningless. The visitor's form loomed, bending, shifting, impossible, and I understood fully, viscerally, that it had come for more than fear. It had come for me. The whispers intensified, a chorus now, echoing from every corner: "You cannot hide. You cannot flee. You belong to me." I closed my eyes, shaking, tears streaming, and tried to will it away, tried to cling to what little sanity I had left. And then I felt it, the first tangible pressure, the brush of cold that was not air, the weight of something impossible settling across my chest. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I realized, the visitor had made contact. It was no longer a presence to be observed. It was real, it was physical, and it was claiming its prey. I could feel its strength against mine, an invisible force that I could not fight, could not push, could not escape. I had survived nights of terror, nights of whispered threats and knocks at the door, but now I understood that survival had limits. The midnight visitor had escalated, and I was trapped in the first stage of its claim. By the time the first rays of dawn filtered through the blinds, I was slumped against the wall, trembling, exhausted, hollowed. The figure had withdrawn slightly, but the memory of its gaze, its impossible form, its tangible presence lingered like a shadow over my mind. I knew with bone-deep certainty that it would return tonight, stronger, more insistent, more real. And I knew equally that the coming nights would push me beyond the edge of endurance. The first contact had been made. There would be no turning back. By the 15th night, exhaustion and fear had become indistinguishable from one another. My body was weak from sleepless nights, my mind frayed by the constant assault of whispers, shadows, and impossible presence. But nothing had prepared me for what was coming. The midnight visitor no longer waited outside doors, no longer lurked in corners. It was hunting me, actively, deliberately, moving through the house with a predatory awareness that sent shivers down my spine. I had tried barricades, isolation, even sitting frozen in my study. Each attempt at safety had failed. Tonight, I realized, there would be no safe room, no refuge. Every hallway, every stair, every doorway had become a hunting ground. I could feel it moving through the house, bending space, manipulating shadows, controlling the air, shaping reality itself. I knew it would find me, and I could do nothing to stop it. The evening passed in an almost unbearable tension. I paced, I listened, I tried to anticipate its movements, but the house itself seemed alive now, each creak and whisper a signal that the visitor was near. I avoided the front door entirely, I avoided windows, corners, even the light switches, which flickered and stuttered in response to its presence. Every step I took felt calculated, measured, as if I were being observed and tested. And then, at 12:07, the first knock came, not at the door, but behind me, from the very walls themselves. Knock. 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 The sound was deafening in the small, dimly lit room. I whirled, flashlight raised, heart hammering, and saw the shadows twisting toward me, moving independently of the light. They were faster than ever, flowing across the floor and walls, forming shapes that defied comprehension. The air grew heavier, almost solid, pressing in on my chest, constricting my lungs. I staggered backward, struggling to breathe, struggling to think, and realized with absolute certainty that the visitor had begun its hunt. It whispered my name, a low, deliberate sound that vibrated in my skull. Run. But I couldn't. My legs refused to obey. Every instinct screamed to flee, to hide, to escape, but my body was trapped in the oppressive gravity of its presence. I could feel it moving through the house, circling, stalking, manipulating shadows to cut off every possible path. There was no escape, no sanctuary, only the endless, suffocating presence of the hunt. The shadows reached out toward me, curling around my arms, brushing against my skin. I tried to shake them off, to flee, but it was futile. Each movement seemed slower, as though the air itself had thickened into resistance. And then I saw it, its form coalescing from the darkness at the far end of the room. Taller than any human, impossibly thin, its hollow eyes fixed on me with a predatory intent that made my stomach turn. Its elongated limbs stretched, bending unnaturally, moving closer without moving at all. I screamed, a desperate, raw sound that echoed through the house, and lunged toward the door, praying that flight might work this time. The figure responded instantly, bending reality, manipulating the shadows, closing off every path I tried to take. Hallways elongated, doors shifted in space, furniture moved to block my retreat. I realized with horror that the house itself was now part of the hunt, reshaped by the visitor into a trap from which there was no escape. My heart hammered as I ran blindly, turning corners and leaping over obstacles. Shadows coiled along the walls, stretching, reaching, following, almost tangible now. The whispers multiplied, overlapping, echoing from every direction, "You cannot hide. You belong. You belong." My mind struggled to comprehend, to reason, to fight, but every thought was shredded by panic. I stumbled into the living room, the flashlight flickering, and for a moment, I dared to hope that perhaps the visitor had slowed, had paused. But then I felt it, pressure, cold, suffocating, pressing in from every side. The shadows surged, moving faster than any normal being could. I was cornered, entirely, and I understood fully that the hunt was not merely a test of courage or endurance, it was a predator claiming its prey. The figure advanced, and I saw more details than ever before. Its elongated fingers stretched unnaturally, claws that did not touch yet grazed my skin with a sensation colder than ice. Its hollow eyes burned, pulling at my mind, feeding on my fear, bending the shadows and walls to keep me trapped. I screamed, thrashing, trying to break free, but resistance was meaningless. Every movement I made, every attempt to flee, only tightened the invisible cage surrounding me. I realized then that survival meant more than barricades or flight, it meant endurance, mental fortitude, and a fragile clarity that I could barely summon. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to shrink, trying to disappear into the shadows, trying to convince the visitor that I was not worth the effort. But it was relentless, circling, bending the room, the very structure of the house, reshaping it to the rhythm of the hunt. Minutes, or hours, passed in a blur of darkness, shadows, and whispers. My chest burned, my legs trembled, and my mind teetered on the edge of collapse. The visitor had made the house itself an extension of its will, a labyrinth of terror with me trapped at the center. And then, as if satisfied with its dominance, it paused, retreating slightly into the corners, lingering, observing, preparing for the next stage of the hunt. By dawn, I was slumped on the floor, trembling, hollowed, my mind frayed, knowing fully that the hunt was far from over. The visitor had escalated, adapted, and made its presence physical, tangible, unavoidable. There would be no escape, no refuge, no comfort. Only the relentless chase, the constant pressure, and the unshakable knowledge that I belonged to it now, utterly and irreversibly. By the 16th night, I was no longer simply surviving. I was living in constant terror, but the relentless hunt, the whispered threats, and the oppressive presence of the midnight visitor had forced me into a single, terrible clarity: if I wanted to survive at all, I had to confront it. Avoidance had failed. Isolation had failed. Fleeing had failed. The house had become its domain, and I had no choice but to face the impossible, the incomprehensible, the entity that had claimed me so thoroughly. I spent the evening preparing, not barricades or lights this time, but myself. I focused on my breathing, my heartbeat, my senses, trying to anchor myself in reality. I gathered a single flashlight, my phone, and a heavy wooden bat I had kept for protection, and positioned myself in the living room, the largest, most central part of the house. If the visitor wanted to confront me, this was where it would happen. I had decided I would meet it head-on. As the clock crept closer to 12:07, the air thickened unnaturally, vibrating with tension. Shadows in the corners elongated and twisted, moving independently, coalescing into forms that made my stomach churn. Every instinct screamed to run, but I stood my ground. The house seemed to lean in, walls bending slightly, ceilings pressing down, every surface imbued with the entity's will. It was here, it was coming, and there was no turning back. Then the knock came. Knock. 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 Louder than ever, reverberating through the floorboards, the walls, the very air. The sound was not just noise, it was pressure, a tangible assertion of dominance. And then, I heard the whisper, unmistakable, deliberate: "You belong. You cannot escape." I held the flashlight and raised the bat, trying to anchor myself in the physical, tangible world. The shadows coalesced into the humanoid form I had seen before, taller, darker, more imposing than ever, with hollow eyes that seemed to suck the warmth and light from the room. Its presence pressed against me, cold and insistent, bending reality, warping the space, making the very floorboards beneath my feet feel unsteady. I shouted, a defiant, desperate sound, and swung the bat at the nearest shadow. My hands trembled violently. The shadow twisted away, faster than I could comprehend, flowing around the swing, unaffected. I realized fully that this confrontation would not be physical in the usual sense. The visitor's power was absolute. It manipulated shadows, air, space, and fear itself. My bat, my fists, my voice, these were trivial compared to the force I faced. It moved closer, the room growing colder, darker, the shadows pressing in from all sides. I could feel the weight of its gaze, pulling at my mind, feeding on my fear, twisting my thoughts. I tried to focus, to think, to act, to anchor myself in my own body, but panic threatened to consume me. Yet, in that moment, a spark of defiance ignited. I would not surrender without understanding, without resisting, without facing the entity that had hunted me relentlessly. I called its name aloud, as absurd as it felt. "Who are you? What do you want?" The response was immediate, a cold, omnipresent whisper that seemed to reverberate through my bones. "I am what you fear. I am what you cannot escape. You belong to me." The shadows twisted violently, forming jagged shapes, clawing toward me, brushing my skin with icy tendrils that left my body trembling. My heart raced, my breath caught, but I stood my ground. I had no weapons, no strength, no conventional power. My only tool was my mind, my focus, my willingness to face the impossible. I moved slowly, deliberately, shining the flashlight on the coalescing figure. Its hollow eyes glared, and I felt the pressure intensify, as if it could reach inside me, touch my very soul. I swung the bat again, more out of instinct than hope. The shadow bent around it, absorbing the impact, then lunged closer, almost tactile, almost solid. I screamed, not just in fear but in defiance. I shouted, trying to assert my presence, my will, my humanity. "I will not belong to you." I yelled, my voice cracking, my body shaking. The shadows recoiled slightly at the intensity of my resistance. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt it, the first reaction, the first acknowledgement that my will mattered. The whispers continued, overlapping, a chorus of voices that seemed to vibrate through the walls. You cannot escape. You belong. You belong. But I held my ground, standing in the center of the living room, bat raised, flashlight cutting through the darkness, and for the first time, I felt a thread of control. Not over the visitor, not over the house, but over myself. Minutes passed, or was it hours? Time had no meaning under its oppressive presence. The shadows writhed, the air thickened, and the temperature plummeted. Yet I stood, trembling but unyielding, staring into the impossible darkness, facing the force that had haunted me for 16 nights. I realized then that confrontation was not about winning. It was about acknowledgement, about claiming my mind and spirit, about refusing to surrender entirely. As the first light of dawn touched the edges of the blinds, the shadows withdrew slightly, the pressure lifted marginally, and the whispers faded. I was exhausted, hollowed, trembling, but still standing. The confrontation had not ended the threat. The visitor had not retreated entirely. But I had faced it. And in that facing, I had found the faintest spark of power in myself, the understanding that even in the presence of the impossible, I could assert my will, however fragile. The midnight visitor remained, lurking, patient, inevitable. But for the first time, I understood that the nights ahead would be a battle not just of survival, but of defiance, courage, and determination. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the final confrontation was approaching. By the 17th night, I had nothing left to lose. Sleep had become a distant memory, my body weak, my mind frayed from the relentless torment of the midnight visitor. The house, once a refuge, was now a labyrinth of fear, every shadow and creak a reminder of the inescapable presence that had claimed it, and me. But exhaustion had a strange clarity. I knew what I had to do. I could no longer run, hide, or barricade myself. The visitor would not relent, and neither could I. Tonight, I would confront it fully, face it directly, and either survive or be consumed entirely. I spent the evening gathering everything I could use, the flashlight, the bat, even a few candles and matches. But mostly, I gathered my will, my determination, my defiance. I positioned myself in the center of the living room, the largest space in the house, which allowed no corners for shadows to hide. I drew a shaky breath and whispered to myself, this ends tonight. No more running. No more fear. Face it. At precisely 12:07, the first knock came, louder than ever, reverberating through the walls, floorboards, and ceilings. My heartbeat thundered in response. The shadows along the corners and ceiling shifted, thickened, and coalesced into the humanoid shape I had seen before, but this time it was taller, broader, more terrifyingly solid. Its hollow eyes glowed with a malevolent intelligence, and the air around it seemed to pulse with cold intent. I could feel the visitor's presence pressing down on me, bending reality, warping the room, shaping every shadow, every inch of the space. It moved closer, sliding across the floor in a way that defied physics, bending the air itself as it approached. I raised the flashlight, shining it directly at the figure, and swung the bat instinctively. The shadows recoiled slightly, then reformed, bending around the bat and ignoring it completely. I realized fully that this confrontation could not be fought with physical force. The visitor existed beyond the rules of the world, and yet it could be challenged by will alone. The whispers began immediately, a low, omnipresent chant, "You belong. You belong. You cannot escape." They pressed against my mind, threatening to overwhelm, to shred my thoughts, to steal what remained of my sanity. I gritted my teeth, focusing on my breathing, grounding myself in the tangible, my body, my voice, my determination. I shouted back into the darkness, "I will not belong. I am not yours." For a moment, the shadows recoiled, twisting violently as if struck. I realized this was the first real effect my defiance had made. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The visitor was powerful, relentless, near omnipotent, but it responded to resistance, to acknowledgement, to the refusal to submit entirely. I could feel its frustration radiating through the room, the temperature dropping, the air tightening around me, yet I stood my ground. Then it attacked, or at least, it seemed to. Shadows shot across the floor and walls, curling into claw-like shapes that lashed at me, brushing my skin with icy pressure that sent shivers deep into my bones. I swung the bat, yelled, and moved with as much intent as I could muster, but each strike was symbolic, a statement of resistance rather than a weapon. I understood that this confrontation was as much mental as it was physical. It was about will, defiance, and refusing to let the fear consume me entirely. But I would not yield. I had been hunted, terrorized, and manipulated for 17 nights, but now, I stood in the center of its domain and refused to submit. The battle continued in silence and whispers, shadows and cold, for what felt like hours. Every fiber of my body ached, my lungs burned, my mind teetered on the edge of collapse, but I remained upright, breathing, defiant. And then, something shifted. The shadows wavered, the cold lightened, and I felt the visitor hesitate. My shouts, my refusal, my determination had made a mark, however slight, on its power. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, the shadows withdrew, the pressure lifted, and the whispers faded into a distant echo. The visitor had not left entirely, it lingered, patient, inevitable, but I was still standing. Hollow, trembling, exhausted, but unbroken. I had survived the final stand, not by defeating the entity entirely, but by refusing to surrender completely. I sank to the floor, the bat slipping from my hands, flashlight dim and flickering beside me. I understood something profound in that moment. The midnight visitor's power was immense, terrifying, and relentless, but it could not claim the human spirit that refused to yield. The battle was not over, but for the first time in 17 nights, I had felt something the visitor could not touch: agency, defiance, the will to continue. By the time the sun rose fully, painting the walls with pale light, I sat in the living room, trembling but awake, aware of every sound, every shadow, every corner. The house remained its domain, but I had asserted mine, however fragile. I knew that the nights ahead would continue to be a struggle, that the visitor would not relent, but I also knew that I had discovered the most important weapon against it: my refusal to belong. The final stand was over, but the war was not yet won. And I would face it again, armed with the knowledge that even in the presence of the impossible, one could assert will, one could resist, one could survive. By the 18th night, the house no longer felt like mine, and yet I remained. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of wind against the windows, reminded me that the midnight visitor had not vanished. It lingered, patient, relentless, omnipresent, a force beyond comprehension. And yet, I had survived. I had faced it, resisted it, and endured nights that would have broken anyone else. In the stillness before midnight, I understood a truth that would remain with me forever: survival was not about defeating the impossible, but refusing to surrender entirely. The living room, where the final stand had occurred, was in disarray. Shadows still curled along the walls, subtle and slow, as if testing me, reminding me that their presence remained. The air was thick, slightly colder than it should have been, yet I could breathe. I moved slowly through the house, checking every room, every corner, every floorboard. The visitor had retreated, temporarily, leaving only faint traces of its presence. I was exhausted, trembling, but fully aware of every step I took. Awareness had become my weapon, vigilance my shield. I paused in the study, the room I had once barricaded in desperation. Furniture had shifted, shadows lingered along the edges, but the oppressive pressure had lifted slightly. I realized that the house itself had become a kind of balance point, a battlefield between the visitor's claim and my own defiance. For 17 nights, it had hunted, tormented, and tested me, but my presence, my will, had changed the rules. I was no longer a passive victim. I had survived, adapted, and endured. As midnight approached, I lit a candle, the flickering flame casting a warm glow against the walls. For the first time in days, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. I remembered the first knock, the creeping shadows, the whispers that had shredded my mind. I remembered every failed attempt to barricade, to escape, to run. And yet, here I was, still standing, still alive. The visitor's power was immense, terrifying, and absolute in many ways, but not complete. I had discovered the one thing it could not touch: my resolve, my defiance, my refusal to belong entirely. I whispered into the darkness, a small but deliberate act of courage: "You do not control me. You cannot have me entirely." The shadows shivered, twisting subtly, a faint echo of acknowledgement, but the visitor did not strike. It had retreated, for now, perhaps learning, observing, waiting. I understood that this was a temporary reprieve. The entity was patient, eternal in its malice. But I had found my power, fragile though it might be, the knowledge that my will could resist, even when everything else seemed hopeless. I moved to the front door, checking locks, windows, the threshold of the house. Everything remained intact, but I felt its lingering presence in the air, in the walls, in the shadows that clung to the corners. I realized with bitter clarity that I would never truly be free of the midnight visitor. It had claimed this house, and a part of me, in ways that could not be undone. But survival was no longer about control, it was about endurance, vigilance, and defiance. And in that, I had won something. The first rays of dawn filtered through the blinds, soft and pale, illuminating the house in a way that felt almost sacred. I stood in the living room, looking at the shadows, the remnants of the night's horrors, and I breathed deeply. For the first time in nearly 3 weeks, I allowed myself a moment of calm. The visitor was still out there, patient and relentless, but I was still here. Still be. I realized then that the story of the midnight knock would not end with a final battle or complete victory. It would be ongoing, a constant struggle between fear and defiance, presence and will, darkness and light. And yet, I had learned that even in the presence of the impossible, one could assert agency. One could resist. One could survive. The house was quiet now, the shadows subdued but not gone. I knew they would return, as they always did, but I also knew that I had found a strength within myself I had never known before. The midnight visitor could knock, could whisper, could bend reality itself, but it could not take the will to endure, the determination to resist. That was mine, wholly and unassailably. As the sun rose fully, spilling golden light into the house, I sat in the living room, exhausted but awake. The visitor had not left, but I was no longer afraid in the same way. Fear had become a tool, a weapon, a way to focus my mind and sharpen my senses. I would remain vigilant, I would remain aware, but I had survived, and in that survival, I had reclaimed something essential. The midnight knock would come again, of that I was certain. Shadows would twist, whispers would return, and the oppressive presence would test me once more. But I had endured 17 nights, confronted the impossible, and survived the final stand. And for now, that was enough. I had faced the darkness, refused to belong, and found within myself a spark that no shadow could extinguish. I took a deep breath, standing in the quiet house, aware of every corner, every creak, every faint movement. I knew the visitor was patient, but I had patience too. And I would endure, as I had for these 18 nights, facing each knock, each whisper, each shadow, with defiance, awareness, and the unshakable knowledge that survival was not about escaping, it was about refusing to surrender. The night had ended, but the story continued. And I was still here. The nights have passed, one after another, each heavier than the last, each a battle between the shadows and the fragile light I carry within me. The midnight visitor has not gone. It lingers still, patient, relentless, bending the house, whispering in the corners, testing the limits of my mind and spirit. Every knock at the door, every subtle shift of the shadows, every cold brush of air reminds me that it is never truly gone. It waits. It watches. It learns. And yet, something within me has changed. I have changed. I have faced the impossible, stared into the hollow eyes of a force beyond comprehension, and refused to surrender entirely. The fear that once consumed me, that drove me to barricade myself in desperate isolation, has not disappeared, but it has become a tool. It sharpens my senses, focuses my mind, and steels my will. I have learned that survival is no longer about hiding. It is about endurance, about vigilance, and about the courage to stand even when the darkness seems absolute. The house remains claimed, the shadows thick and twisting, the air heavy with its presence. But I remain too. My body trembles, my heart pounds, yet I am upright, aware, alive. I have discovered something the visitor cannot touch: defiance. No matter how patient, how powerful, how relentless it may be, it cannot extinguish the spark of will that refuses to bow. That spark, however fragile, is mine, and it is unassailable. Every knock, every whisper, every shift of shadow is a reminder of the nights I endured. But they are also a reminder of my strength, the small, quiet victories of refusing to belong, of asserting my presence in a world warped by terror. I know the visitor will return. I know the nights ahead will test me again, that the shadows will twist, that the whispers will pierce the silence, that the impossible will press closer. But I also know that I have faced it and stood my ground. The midnight knock is not over, and perhaps it never will be. Its presence may linger in corners, in the cold drafts of empty rooms, in the fleeting shadows at the edge of perception. But so too does my defiance. Fear is its tool, but courage is mine. The nights will continue. The knocks will come. The visitor will return. But as long as I breathe, as long as I stand, I remain unclaimed. And in that, there is a fragile, unshakable victory. For no matter how dark the night, no matter how relentless the force that hunts us, there is always the possibility to endure, to resist, to survive. I am still here. The visitor waits. But I will wait too. And I will face it again. The nights have passed, one after another, each heavier than the last, each a battle between the shadows and the fragile light I carry within me. The midnight visitor has not gone. It lingers still, patient, relentless, bending the house, whispering in the corners, testing the limits of my mind and spirit. Every knock at the door, every subtle shift of the shadows, every cold brush of air reminds me that it is never truly gone. It waits. It watches. It learns. And I know, deep down, that it will return when I least expect it. And yet, something within me has changed. I have changed. I have faced the impossible, stared into the hollow eyes of a force beyond comprehension, and refused to surrender entirely. The fear that once consumed me, that drove me to barricade myself in desperate isolation, has not disappeared, but it has become a tool. It sharpens my senses, focuses my mind, and steels my will. I have learned that survival is no longer about hiding. It is about endurance, about vigilance, and about the courage to stand even when the darkness seems absolute. The house remains claimed, the shadows thick and twisting, the air heavy with its presence. But I remain too. My body trembles, my heart pounds, yet I am upright, aware, alive. I have discovered something the visitor cannot touch: defiance. No matter how patient, how powerful, how relentless it may be, it cannot extinguish the spark of will that refuses to bow. That spark, however fragile, is mine, and it is unassailable. Every knock, every whisper, every shift of shadow is a reminder of the nights I endured. But they are also a reminder of my strength, the small, quiet victories of refusing to belong, of asserting my presence in a world warped by terror. I know the visitor will return. I know the nights ahead will test me again, that the shadows will twist, that the whispers will pierce the silence, that the impossible will press closer. But I also know that I have faced it and stood my ground. I remember each night vividly, the first knock that shattered my illusion of safety, the endless whispers that shredded my mind, the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with an intelligence of their own. Each moment left scars, some visible, some etched deep in my soul. Yet here I stand, hollowed, trembling, and exhausted, but undefeated. I have learned that endurance is its own form of power, that survival is a defiance as much as a victory. The midnight knock is not over, and perhaps it never will be. Its presence may linger in corners, in the cold drafts of empty rooms, in the fleeting shadows at the edge of perception. But so too does my defiance. Fear is its tool, but courage is mine. The nights will continue. The knocks will come. The visitor will return. But as long as I breathe, as long as I stand, I remain unclaimed. And in that, there is a fragile, unshakable victory. For no matter how dark the night, no matter how relentless the force that hunts us, there is always the possibility to endure, to resist, to survive. I am still here. The visitor waits. But I will wait too. And I will face it again. I have come to understand something vital. The visitor thrives on expectation, on terror, on the certainty that I am alone and powerless. But in claiming even a sliver of my attention, in confronting it, I have rewritten the rules. It can manipulate shadows, bend reality, distort the house, but it cannot bend the part of me that refuses to belong, that refuses to be consumed. That part, no matter how fragile or trembling, remains mine. I will continue to live in this house, aware of its every creak, every flicker of shadow, every whisper in the night. I will never truly feel safe, not in the way I once did, not in the world that existed before the first knock. But I have learned to live in defiance, to coexist with the impossible, to assert my presence against it. Fear is no longer only a weapon against me, it is a reminder that I am still human, still present, still alive. So the nights continue, and the visitor waits. I hear the faint echo of a knock in my mind even as I write this, a reminder that the story is not over. But I am ready. I will endure. I will resist. And I will survive. The midnight knock will echo again, as it always does, and when it does, I will meet it, not with terror, but with the awareness and courage I have cultivated. It cannot claim me entirely. It can only test the strength I